Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday, July 6, 2023 Escondido Planning Commission meeting. First order is call to order, flag salute. Commissioner Barbet will lead us.
And begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Chair Paul.
Yes, present.
Vice Chair Barbet.
Present.
Commissioner Barber.
Here and more.
Commissioner Fitzgerald.
Present.
Commissioner Macaro.
Present.
Commissioner Spear.
Present.
And Commissioner Weiler.
Here.
Next item is approval of minutes for the June 27th, 2023 meeting. Is there any questions or motion, please?
Move approval of the minutes.
Second.
Call for the vote.
Chair Paul.
Yes, approved.
Vice Chair Barbet.
Approved.
Commissioner Barber. Commissioner Fitzgerald.
Approve.
Commissioner Macaro.
Approve.
Commissioner Spear.
Abstain.
Commissioner Weiler.
Yes.
The vote to approve the minutes is 6-0 and with one abstain.
Do we have any written communications or oral communications?
We have none at this time.
Thank you. Then our public hearing, PHG 20-0028, East Valley Specific Plan. Adam, do you have a report?
I do, and if you just bear with me, I'm going to go down to the table there so I can play with some fun PowerPoints and the like, so I'll be right back with you. All right, good evening, Chair Paul, members of the Planning Commission, Adam Feinstone, your city planner, back here one more time with the hopefully final go-through of this East Valley Specific Plan. Before I get into this, I do want to say thank you all for all the hard work, effort, dedication you've put into getting this thing across the finish line. It's been really a blessing to have you guys really putting that thought and effort and concern and care about it into this. So really do thank you for that. So I'm going to kind of just run through things. We're going to look at what we're doing now is just the continuation of the public hearing. We'll review the revisions slightly. And then really the big one is to finalize our parking requirements that we've been discussing, primarily related to residential parking, and then we will look at a recommendation to City Council. So here's the cover again. So we had just a quick summary of the meetings we've had. June 13th was the first time we had this in front of the body, and it was a time where staff brought forward a list of concerns that we had identified for the Planning Commission to provide some input into. The following meeting, we we came back a week later at a special meeting on the 20th of June, and the the Planning Commission brought forward some concerns and considerations that they were interested to talk through, and some revisions that they were looking at. Small list or a list of them here. I'm not going to read through them in any detail, but you see them there. Following week on the 27th, which was last Tuesday, we came back again for a noticed public hearing and provided a presentation on the specific plan, primarily for the benefit of the public who was here. The commission, you folks have heard it a couple times at this point. There were a couple public speakers and a couple pieces of written correspondence read into the record. Primary topics that we discussed at that meeting were open space, parking, and land use. Those were, or land uses. Those were kind of the largest of the outstanding items that we were still working through. And I think at this point, we've gotten through most of it. Parking. So for parking requirements, the revisions that we've dealt with are with regard to the commercial. We've established maximum parking requirements for retail and office of 1 space per 250, maximum for restaurant of 1 per 100 square feet. But we did build in an allowance to exceed that should anyone desire to through the request for an administrative adjustment. We removed the maximum bicycle parking requirement. There's no real need or reason to cap that. We referenced the California Building Code as it relates to EV parking spaces, and we removed a maximum allowance for loading spaces as well. So there was really not much of a reason to have that either, similar to the bike parking situation. We made some revisions to the open space requirements. First was a ability or the requirement or the need to define a few terms. So we defined public, common, and private open space. Public being areas that are available for the public at large, common being areas that are open and available to residents of a specific development, and private being space that is specific to your unit. We updated and modified the minimum requirements for open space to 200 square feet per unit down from 250. We also use this as a way to incentivize people to build to their target production point by further reducing it all the way down to 125 square feet per unit for projects that did meet their TPP. We reduced the requirement for landscaping so that it does not eat into the available site for development potential. Still requires, I believe, the minimum that we've got for any of the districts is 15%. So there's still that requirement on site. We reduced setbacks as well, and that was, again, to assist in providing a more buildable site. And then we also removed some references for the historic district. For some reason, those had crept into this specific plan. There is no portion of the downtown historic district in this specific plan area, and I don't know where it came from. They were in there erroneously. They've now been removed. Land use allowances we discussed, we've made a few revisions to. It would be to prohibit secondhand and thrift stores in all districts, to allow consignment stores via CUP in the commercial district, to allow EV charging stations, for-fee EV charging stations, so akin to what a gas station is for fueled vehicles, permitted by right in the MU, the mixed use in the commercial general zone. Reason being is that the state has mandated that has basically put restrictions that we cannot prohibit gas stations fueling stations of that sort. So if someone would like to open or build an EV fueling station, they could do that. We clarified some of the information regarding educational uses, put in a prohibition for auto repair in the mixed use district, and required a CUP for it in the general commercial. Required a CUP for boutique auto sales in both of those districts, and we have modified to allow a firearms dealer via CUP in both of those districts. And I can discuss that with you guys further if you'd like. I did have a conversation with Chief Varso and got some information from him there. So there's a couple additional revisions that are not reflected in the draft that you have in front of you that myself and one of your commissioners here had noted and provided to me. There's a reference to Class 2 space for commercial loading, and that was intended to only be a Class 2 bike parking space. So that's not relevant there. We'll strike that. There will need to be some clarification to the language in section 5.6.1, where it talks about parking requirements and references minimums versus maximums shall not be more than or less than. We're going to need to clean that up so that it reads that maximum is applicable to commercial designation or commercial uses, minimums are applicable to residential. For some reason, figure 4.2 was erroneously replaced with the ground floor retail figure. I don't know why, but we'll get that fixed. And then we're also going to be adding a little bit of language regarding the preemption of parking requirements based on pursuant to certain statute. And I'll talk about this in just a moment as well. Excuse me. All right, so as part of the review here, or part of the project, we have prepared a program environmental impact report. It identified significant impacts, potentially significant impacts in the areas of air quality, bio, cultural and tribal cultural resources, and noise. We've been able to apply mitigation measures to the impacts to reduce them. However, regardless of the mitigation that we've been able to apply, noise would remain significant and unavoidable, an impact there. And that's primarily due to increased road noise based on an increase in traffic volume. as well as unknown needs for ground disturbance and vibration that might be involved if there's any need to blast or grind or something of that sort. That would be determined on a case-by-case basis based on a project, but we have no ability to know what might or might not be needed at this point, so we can't say with any certainty that there is no impact or that it can be mitigated beyond down to the less than significant level. So the draft program EIR was sent out for public review, released for 45 days. We received 2 comments on them. Final EIR has been prepared. It includes a summary of corrections and revisions. It includes those comments that we received as well as responses to those comments. It includes also a mitigation monitoring and reporting program, which identifies the mitigation measures that have been identified and applied to the project, and a mechanism by which we can track and make sure that we're monitoring and reporting on it as necessary. And then we also have, it also includes strike through underline draft of the, or version of the draft EIR, so that we can see what those revisions that were made are. Finally, it includes 2 other items. One is findings of fact, and the other is a statement of overriding considerations. Statement of overriding considerations is required when there are specific economic, legal, social, technical, or other considerations that are necessary to take into account that would make the need for mitigation or use of any of the alternatives that are identified in the EIR infeasible. In this instance, we could not avoid, let's think about this, for impacts that are not that remain significant. If you have if you're not able to reduce them. So I'm thinking about the noise impact with regard to traffic noise. We can't reduce that below a level of significance without completely undermining the whole purpose of the EIR, of the EVSP, because you can't have that increase in traffic. So doing so would result in a project that's not meeting the goals that it's identified. So, residential parking requirements, we'll talk a bit about this here. So the original was proposed back on June 13th. It set a maximum of the numbers you see here. So that was a different avenue than we've ever gone with parking before. It did still maintain a minimum of 1 covered space per unit, but it also had that maximum in there. That was not received well by the commission, and understandably. So we have gone through, we went through on June 27th, we presented a revised version that had 1 covered space per unit minimum. So it's kept that same minimum, but it removed any maximum, excuse me, and with the intent that the idea that the market would drive what that maximum or what that parking is needed for any project. So I want to kind of circle back to some of the statutory requirements that I had mentioned. AB 2097 is a requirement that was put in place. I believe it became effective beginning of this year. And it restricts the ability to apply minimum parking requirements anywhere within a half mile of a major transit stop. And the definition of a major transit stop includes any transit stops that are included in the 2035 regional plan, which are these. So along Valley here, East Valley Parkway, that's, I believe, at Harding, Ash, that is at Elm, Grape, and then this is there at Valley Boulevard, Grand. So in looking at this and in doing some measurements, the entire EVSP is within 1/2 mile of those stops. So regardless of what we put in place, hypothetically, someone can say, hey, I don't want to provide parking, and we could not require that. What we are going to do as part of the approval here, or as part of the request here, is we're going to definitely get from the chair, the commission, what the intended and desired parking requirements will be. We will include that, and we'll include language in the specific plan stating that that these are the requirements unless preempted or unless modified by statute. It's possible that AB 2097 gets rescinded, gets modified. Other statutes come into play that are more or less restrictive that might override it or supersede it. So we do want to have whatever the number is that the commission would want in there. We want to have that established regardless of this current preemption. So what I want to do now is go through a list of options. I created a menu of options, 6 of them, and I did send those to you folks earlier today. So we'll go through those, and then we'll run through a number of scenarios for different project types that I've also provided, and you've got those in front of you as well. So we've got a couple ideas here is to maintain what that recommendation was from June 27th, which is that 1 covered space per unit, no maximums. We've got the idea of complying with the with the zoning code. You see the numbers here. Should be noted also that anywhere, wherever it might apply, unless otherwise stated, guest parking would typically be 1 quarter space per unit, so 1 space for every 4 units. So think about that as the assumption used when you're looking at these. We have an idea that's 75% of the zoning code requirement, which is the reduction in 25% as we discussed at the meeting last time. Numbers would look like this. And I'll say you're going to see some of these items where, hypothetically a 1-bedroom, I think the zoning code requires 1.5, 2-bedroom is 1.75, but when you round, you get the same number for each. So that kind of is where that lands. I did something where we grouped them by bedroom count. So basically smaller units, 1 or 2 bedroom, studio or 1s have 1 space per unit, and larger units have 1.75. It's just an idea that I thought might be appropriate based on the potential occupancy of units of those sizes. Using the June 13th numbers as maximums, or as minimums instead of maximums. So this is similar to the the zoning code, but a little bit different. And the one thing also you'll note here is that guest parking is different here. Limits, it doesn't require any for studios. It requires a 0.3 for 1 and 2 and a half a space for a 3-bed. So it's more for 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms than our zoning code would require, but less than it is, or less for the studios, I guess. And then I had another one based on some discussion, and I think also kind of the public comment that was provided last time in writing, the written comment regarding what about doing something where it's lower requirements for smaller lots. So I've thought about that and looked at, okay, lots less than 10,000, which would basically wrap in all those 7,000 square foot lots that are around there, requiring 1 space per unit, and then lots that are greater than 10,000, looking at that 75% of zoning code requirement. So those are the 6 options I've identified. One thing you'll also note as we get into the examples, in no case has anything gone less than 1 space per unit. So that has been maintained for every option. So what I've done is I've identified, I think there's 4 examples here, and there are, within each example, there are 2 subtypes, I guess. One of them is like you see here, it kind of divvies out the units based on different unit sizes. So the assumption was 50% 2-bedroom, 25% 1-bedroom, and 25% studio. That number, or that kind of ratio, holds throughout all these scenarios, except when you have something where 25% of 5 or of 10 is 2.5. You can't have 2.5 of a unit. So in those instances, you would have 3 1-bedrooms and 2 studios, and you'll see that as we get further on. The other option, and I'll just jump to it real quick and then come back here, is to have everything as a 2-bedroom unit. So those are 2 options and two potentials that we might see for projects. So for a 100-unit project with the array of different unit sizes, you get numbers anywhere from the first column is without guest parking required. The second column is with guest parking required with that quarter space, except for the June 13th maximum. Actually, I apologize. In this instance, we just applied the 0.25 for that as well. But you'll see these numbers here, they range anywhere from 1 space to 150 spaces based on the zoning code or the June 13th numbers. That's without guest parking. With guest parking, they range from 125 to 175. If you look at the same project or the same number of units at all 2 bedrooms, those numbers jump up all the way to 175 where it was 150, 200 where it was 175. The only thing that remains static are the 2 things that remain static. I'm sorry, the one thing remains static is the 1 space per unit. That doesn't change at all. Next, I kind of circled back to the 7,000 square foot lot in the urban 4-5 district. That would typically allow anywhere about 4 or 5 units on the lot. I think that 4 units would hit that target production point on a 7,000 square foot lot. So that's what I looked at here. So 1 studio, 1 bedroom, 1 2 bedroom. These numbers are a lot lower, but the scale is a lot smaller, obviously. So anywhere from 4 to 6 spaces without a guest parking requirement, 5 to 7 with a guest parking requirement. When you look at that for projects that are all 2 bedroom, you've still got that static number for the 1 space per unit, 4 or 5. Your 2 or your larger numbers though jump up to 7 or 8 spaces depending on which methodology we're looking at here. Then we've got our 10-unit project on a 10,000 square foot site. So this is something that you might see in the mixed use district where you get up to 80 per acre. You might be seeing 10 units on a 10,000 square foot site, which would be right about your target production point at 45 per acre, slightly over, I believe. So these are what you would be looking at there. You still have that 1 space per unit. When you look at the first item, it's still 10 spaces, so 1 per unit, regardless of the number of bedrooms. And you look at guest space requirement of 12 total at that instance. It should also be noted, and I did not mention this earlier, but our zoning code stipulates that any total number of parking spaces that ends up fractional, it is always rounded down. So that's something that you'll see. This would hypothetically have been 12 and a half. It gets rounded down to 12. Even if it was 12.9, it would get rounded down to 12. You'll see the numbers going all the way up to 15 or even up to 17 for the zoning code requirement with or without guest parking. The other numbers kind of range in between there. Looking at the same project or the same property with all 2-bedroom units, be looking at similar numbers for options 1 and 6, so the 1 space per unit, or what's based on lot size, which is when you're less than that, or 10,000 or less, you got that 1 space per unit. Other than that, everything kind of changes, and a lot of it is showing us 17 to 19 spaces, depending on which methodology we're looking at. And then the reduction, 75% of zoning code, is somewhere between the top and the bottom, so it's 12 and 14. This will look at the same 10-unit project on a larger site, though, that would not qualify for that reduced number based on lot size. So in this instance, other than the last item here, the one based on lot size, everything would be the same as the prior example. This is just intended to show you that you've got 10 to 12 here versus 11 and 13 here on that last column. Same idea here. It's the same project. It's just the difference in lot size that's really driving the change for number 6 there. So next steps. Assuming that the Planning Commission approves or recommends approval of the East Valley Specific Plan and certification of the EIR tonight, those documents will go before City Council on the 19th of this month. The very next day, we will send a letter to HCD letting them know that the East Valley Specific Plan has been approved, and at that point, we will have met our statutory requirements in order to get our housing element certified. It sometimes takes them up to 60 days to get back to us and say, yes, you're good to go. Considering that we've already gotten to the point of having a letter saying, once you do your rezone, so once you adopt the specific plan, you're good to go. We're hoping that we can cut that 60 days down significantly, but we'll definitely keep you guys posted when that ends, when we get that green light and that thumbs up from HCD. So as far as a recommendation, staff at this point would recommend that the Planning Commission adopt Resolution 2023-11, which recommends City Council certification of the final program EIR, and also that you adopt Resolution 2023-12, which would recommend City Council approval of the East Valley Specific Plan with revisions that would insert the selected residential parking option, would provide language that would identify statutory preemption for certain parking requirements. I would revise Section 561 to address maximums and minimums applying to commercial and residential respectively, and it would replace figure 4.2 with the appropriate figure. That concludes staff's presentation. I do have the various tables as separate files that I can jump back and forth between if the commission would like to do that. But other than that, I'll open it up to any questions the commission may have for me.
Thank you very much, Adam. That's great. So first, I'd like to ask if this is a public meeting, if there are anyone in the audience who would like to speak. Okay, great. Then I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Spears to try to give him some makeup time. If you have anything that we've already gone over that you have questions about, or if you want to just jump into parking.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the work that was done while I was out. I guess a couple questions I have. One of them was, and Adam, maybe you addressed this, but the maximum language that is different in public parking from the private parking, was that in reference to AB 2047, that was a maximum, or was there some other reason?
So there's not a difference between public versus private as far as parking. It's a difference between commercial versus residential.
Thank you.
Sure.
Right. So is that maximum based on AB 2047 in terms of making that a maximum instead of a minimum?
No, it's based on the idea that if people are intended, or the idea is that the goal is that people are walking places, there's more people in the area, that there won't be that much need in commercial areas for that much parking. It's a sea of parking that you usually see in these centers, and that said, there's an opportunity and a mechanism to exceed that if that's the desire.
Okay, that's with the conditional approval to exceed that you're referring to.
Correct. It's an administrative process.
Okay, that was addressed, I assume, in my absence, correct?
Sorry?
You may have addressed a number of other items. I do have some questions. There was one question. I know there are some prohibited commercial uses within the East Valley Specific Plan area, and I had some question on at least one of those that is listed without basically restricted, and that would be, no, I think you addressed that in the table that you showed. You provided conditional review of those, so I scratched that. I think you already addressed that question. Let me see if I have others here that I've listed. can skip that as well. Section 3.2 talks about development impact fees. I was trying to understand where the development impact fees, and maybe there are multiple places where that would be imposed. Is there a quick answer to when that would trigger?
Sure. So development impact fees are required anytime someone does new construction, whether it be in the East Valley area, downtown, anywhere in town. So those are standard fees that have been adopted through council over the years and modified, and they're required even regardless of this document.
With designation I saw on the map of, I believe it was 3 separate park zoned areas. I guess my question, and I can refer to where that is if I can find it real quickly, but I was trying to understand the designation of those 3 zones, and these aren't the linear zones, they're the other 3. What, with those designations in those areas, how do those designations affect fees that would impact anyone trying to develop within those areas?
They don't change.
They don't change. Okay.
They just focus any improvements that we would be looking to do, any city parks that we might be able to fund with those impact fees. We would be looking at those locations.
Would that, for someone within those areas currently that, say, has a business and wanted to do anything as far as approvals, would that impede their ability to
No.
change their use or anything?
No. The use table that's in the specific plan still is there for them.
Okay. Thank you. Section 5.4.1 talks about subsidizing transit passes. I'm just trying to understand, is this, and I believe it's talking about 6 months of transit passes. Trying to understand what that would mean in terms of who's picking up the cost for that. Is this a city cost or is this a developmental cost?
So those aren't required. These are potential solutions or potential options that we would encourage applicants and developers to consider, but they're not a requirement.
Okay, thank you. And that one was already addressed. One question I had was regarding the map, section 5.2. It shows a number of zone 2. I believe it designates these as bike lanes in zone 2. Which, as I look at zone 2, I think that requires a minimum width bike path. As I looked at that, the areas that are marked on that map on 5.2, it shows a pretty extensive number of streets that would have bike paths. I assume we're saying that we're taking those streets and we're adding bike lanes to all of those streets, if I understand that correctly. Is that correct?
So they're not necessarily bike lanes. They may be, or they may be bike routes. So a bike route is something that's just signed as a preferred route for cyclists to take. It doesn't have a separated lane or anything. It may have sharrows that would encourage, or that would basically be share the lane with the cyclist and only pass when safe. But it's not going to be striped lanes on all of those streets.
When I looked at the designation, it looked like what you characterize as just marked paths and not lanes was zone 3 and not zone 2. Is that correct?
Give me a second. Let me look at that for sure.
I believe
So I'm sorry, I was going to mention class 2 are bike lanes, class 3 are routes.
so. Class 2 looks like a fairly extensive area, and that inclusion to me seems like we're taking a whole bunch of streets and we're adding bike lanes to all of those streets, some of which might be a little narrow and might be fairly busy. Is that correct? Am I assuming that all of those would then have bike lanes added to them?
Correct.
So it's-
It would likely be within existing roadway widths. A lot of the area, if you're looking, for instance, I mean, the one that runs straight through the middle of the specific plan area along Date, that's got an excess of right-of-way. But we're currently doing our comprehensive active transportation strategy and modifying that. That's going to include a thorough review and update of our mobility and infrastructure element to address any type of active or other types of transportation. And that will be looking at whether these are what's shown here. It may be superseded in the future with other policy documents. But at this point, this is what the intent is. I don't know, Owen, is there anything else that might be appropriate to share with council, commission at this point?
No, I mean, I think you covered it with, the cats will answer in more detail.
What
A lot.
I guess I'm questioning is, for example, I think Juniper is on that. Juniper's fairly narrow residential street, fairly busy at times. So are we talking about, I don't know how wide Juniper is. Are we talking about saying, well, we're going to take each side of Juniper and put a bike lane on both sides and restrict the traffic even further for Juniper? I think East Valley Parkway is also on that list of two. What happens to parking? Right now we have parallel parking along there. How does that work? Are we locking ourselves into saying, hey, we're going to have to put bike lanes on all these streets without having looked carefully at the impacts of those in those particular areas?
So the CATS, the Comprehensive Active Transportation Strategy, will get into that detail. These are ideas and goals that would be great to be able to achieve, but the future will dictate based on what those additional studies reveal. So,
what language in what we have? How is the language? I guess is the language say this is where it's going to be, or this is where it could be? How locked in are we to this plan and those designations at this point?
we're not locked in per se. For instance, I can tell you that, and I will acknowledge I haven't looked at what the mobility and infrastructure element has as far as bike lanes at this moment, but if you look at the, if you were to look, for instance, at the roadway classifications, a lot of them are showing four-lane collectors along Date, where are we? I'm sorry. Date, Elm, Fig, or Dayton Fig, a couple of the others there. And they're really going to be, they're likely going to be reclassified down to two-lane with parking on both sides because they're just not, the demand for that isn't there. There's not the demand to have that many trips that are going down the streets, and there likely would never be, even with this specific plan being implemented. So that's an example of how, these show existing condition, at least for sure, for the roadways, but they're not mandated. We're not going to necessarily stick with that if future evidence shows that something else is more appropriate.
I would ask, could we look at the language and make sure that we're comfortable with it so that that's true, so that we're not getting.
Yeah, so we discussed that at one of the
You did?
previous meetings.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that's just my concern is, I think what you've characterized sounds really reasonable. I just want to be sure it actually is that way. And that may be the list of my concerns. Let me just.
And as I'm looking real briefly at it, the bike network that is shown here is modeled after what's in our existing bike master plan. So it was in the same mindset that we looked at the roadway classifications based on what's on our general plan.
Right. One question I have is in section 8.2.1 where it talks about CFDs. Are there any areas of this that trigger CFDs?
That would be up to council.
Okay, so that's not specifically dictated in the document, I assume.
Correct, right. City council they are the body that will either apply, rescind, set levies for CFD. It's nothing that the specific plan here does.
Perfect. Thank you. There is well, let's see, table 8.1, it speaks of a development burden for fair share. That seems to me ambiguous. Is there any more clarity on what that fair share would translate to for a developer cost?
It depends on what the improvement is. It's really, if any development project contributes X number of trips to a road that needs to be widened, if there are going to be, let's say there needs to be at 100 trips, they're going to need to make that improvement, and they're doing 10 trips. They're going to be potentially required to pay 10% of that amount. And that's the same regardless if it be in here or any development.
Okay. There was a comment by Mr. Joe Awad regarding drive-throughs. I didn't see any comment or any particular portion of the East Valley Plan that had to do with drive-throughs. Am I mistaken on that, or is there something?
So in the land use table, it does discuss or have commercial drive-through restaurants in there, other drive-through facilities as well that may be addressed. I did look at that, and his property is in the mixed-use district, and it is an area that a drive-through would no longer be a permitted use. So he would have a non-conforming use at that point. There are 7 drive-throughs within the specific plan area. 4 of them are within the commercial general zone or district. That is, whether a property has that or not at this point, you can still have a drive-through in those areas via a CUP. So it would be potentially, even if there's not a CUP, there's an ability to maintain that use on that property. The areas that are in the mixed-use designation or district, they will not allow for drive-throughs in the future. And a lot of the idea is that additional drive-throughs means additional curb cuts, additional vehicles that are queuing and the like, and creating additional conflict points with pedestrian and cyclists.
Okay, what is the designation that would allow a conditional? You said an approval process for someone that, I guess you're saying if they have an existing drive-through.
So if they have an existing drive-through and they want to expand it, if they want to tear it down and rebuild, things like that, sometimes that would trigger the need to obtain a conditional use permit depending on the scope and scale of what they're doing. If they've already got the existing facility, obviously the impact of something like tear down, rebuild isn't going to be as significant as someone looking at putting up a new drive-through in a different location.
So regardless of the designation, any new use of having a drive-through would not be possible even with the conditional.
That's not true. No, in the commercial district, commercial general district, it would be permitted.
Understood. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else have, I want to call it old business, questions on subjects we've already talked about? All right, then,
I actually do, if that's okay.
Yep.
It may not take that long. More like clarification, I guess, regarding the bicycle lanes. So my understanding is that as far as what's going to be upgraded or implemented, it's going to be state funded. There's going to be state grants to fund that project.
Well, the comprehensive, the CATS, I'm just not going to keep spelling it out. The CATS, it is a grant-funded project that's going to create this new plan that's going to identify all types of active transportation that would be available or be designed citywide. It's not going to per se implement these projects. That's a lot larger of a scope than a policy document itself. But we will be looking at pursuing grants for various improvements as we go.
Okay. And then so after the grants, as far as maintaining that, how will that be funded?
As far as maintenance of the facilities?
Mm-hmm. Of the bike lanes and
You mean
the
like
upkeep.
keeping them upkeep
Right,
on them?
upkeep.
That'll be through our public works folks.
Okay, so that would be the city that would absorb that.
Yeah, it's general street maintenance. It would be wrapped into that part of the budget. I mean, whenever they repave streets, they restripe them, and it would be striped as such. And that's actually also an opportunity that's often utilized to provide bike lanes is when it's time to repave and restripe, you've got fresh paint, fresh pavement to work with. So I've seen that happen at times, but it would be looked at, and we would be using the provisions and parameters established by the CATs in order to make determination on that.
Do we have an idea of what the cost would be for something like that, just for maintenance?
I don't. I presume at this point we don't. And
Okay. And the only reason I'm bringing it up is I did have an opportunity by chance to sit next to the Vista mayor over at an event, and we were speaking on some of the improvements that they've done in Vista and what we're doing here. And so I did ask him about the bike lanes, and although they were going to be receiving some state funding or whatever to pay for that, the upkeep, and Vista is much smaller than Escondido, and the area that they were looking at was smaller than what we're looking at. And the maintenance was going to cost around $400,000 a year just to maintain the bike lanes, according to what they have. And it would only be half of it for 1 year and then the other half. So I don't know if we have any numbers on that.
yeah, I'd have to look at those numbers and compare them to what we have going on here. I really
Okay.
can't speak to that.
That just seems a lot to kind of throw to the city and have the people pay for.
Mike, I might be able to speak a little bit. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what Vista's dealing with, but if you've seen what Caltrans did through Escondido on State Route 78 in the green paint and those type of more, that does cost a lot a lot more to maintain. So that might have been what, and I'm not familiar with their project, but that might be what they were dealing with cost-wise.
I think it was just the standard paint would be about $400,000, and then there's one that's called the thermoplastic material, and it lasts much longer, does not require any upkeep, and that was more than triple the amount. So I don't know, but it was just the standard paint.
Yeah, thermoplastic does last a lot, So typical roadway striping lasts a year or so, depending on how wet of a year we have. But the thermoplastic could easily last 5, 10, and we use it primarily in school zones.
Mhm. And I'm just saying that I'm just looking at the additional costs as far as what the city taxpayers are going to be funding, and if it's really necessary as far as the area that it's covering, as you were speaking of Juniper and some other areas that might not be as utilized because it's so narrow. That's just my concern as far as who's going to be picking up the bill on that, and do the city residents, the people of Escondido, want that? So I would just feel more comfortable if I had some numbers.
Okay, parking, how about if we start with Commissioner Barber and work our way down? Pick one.
And if you can let me know what you want up on the screen, either the options or the examples, and I can pull up whatever it is and make sure we got that in front of us if that's needed.
Well, the fellow planning commissioners and staff know my mindset and my goals is, my primary purpose is I want to protect the interests of the future occupants and to help reduce the risk of creating overflow or reducing the overflow parking that are going to be on our public streets. And based on my daily experience here in Escondido and based on our demographics and the choices Escondido residents are having to make to find affordable housing, realizing that the dwelling units are no longer being occupied by the number of persons that we had projected and built our parking space standards around. I don't want to see, when we approve this specific plan, that as we increase the densities in these neighborhoods, I don't want to see us aggravating the parking situation. There was a number of residents of these neighborhoods that were attending the last week's meeting, and they didn't speak. But they spoke to me in the parking lot, And I was curious as to what their purpose was of being here, and that's what their purpose was, is they were concerned about reduced parking accompanying the increased dwelling units. As they stated to me, we already have a severe parking problem, and we already are actually having neighbors fighting amongst each other, quarreling at least. One said they thought they saw people were sometimes going to go to fisticuffs over trying to compete for whatever available parking might be at their units or on blocks that have closer access home. And they point out that we're not just talking about in the future that people are going to be competing for these parking spaces when they return home to work. We're talking about families returning from family events, having to walk their children to their units from the streets that they might have to be parking on, and having to unload the groceries from the trunks of their cars and multiple trips if they're parking 2 blocks down the street from their units. So I'm concerned, and I'm against reducing parking standards in the specific plan. And at this moment, and I didn't have an opportunity to see your email out of this, at this moment as I'm being introduced to these options, I'm preferring 2 and 4, but I would like to listen to the discussion from the rest of my commissioners.
So for reference, 2 is using the Escondido zoning code numbers, and 4 is looking at it by bedroom size. So 1 and 2 bedroom, or 2 and 3 bedrooms have 1.75, and studio 1 bedrooms require 1 space.
Commissioner Fitzgerald.
I'm in agreement with what Commissioner Barber said. However, as far as selecting the one between 2 and 4, I have to say, I have to think about it a little bit more. I want to hear what everybody has to say, because this is not an area that I'm very well versed in. So I want to hear what other opinions are.
Spear.
I do appreciate the previous comments by Commissioner Barber, and I'm in agreement. I have the same concerns. And my experience is I see and I have seen this problem a lot, not just here. I don't want it to be our problem in Escondido. The fact is, it sounds like we already have somewhat of a problem. I don't want to certainly exacerbate it. I also think in terms of, Adam, as you were going through these numbers, to me, it's monopoly money, because we're talking about numbers of units that mean absolutely nothing to me. And so in thinking about the options that were presented, I think we have the current parking zoning regulations in option 2. I assume that those were based on tried and true, tested over time recommendations, calculations, ways of coming up with those numbers that represented some form of reality, some form of need. My thought is the rest sound like monopoly numbers to me. So I'm leaning towards using the existing zoning of 2, unless there's some tangible, numerical, statistical study that says, well, we should reduce it or we should increase it. I would tend to lean towards sticking with what we have.
Barbe.
I appreciate all the comments so far. I actually believe that option 2 is, I think, looking to the future. If in fact we're going to be seeing fewer cars, the need, less need for cars in these very dense areas. If people are living in high-density area and they're using more public transportation as that public transportation evolves, though I completely acknowledge that it's going to take a long time to evolve, i.e. the Sandag Regional Plan and how that might be implemented here, or how it might actually play out in Escondido. It's really hard to say at this point, and how long that might take. I think this is a 15-year plan, is that right, as I recall?
The specific plan?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's coinciding sunset on, along with the general plan in 2035.
2035. So I suspect that the evolution of car use in this region is going to be fairly slow in terms of reduction of use of cars, in terms of the need for spaces, et cetera. I would actually, given the fact that there is a need to incentivize and try to get there, to try to head that way, I think I would go actually with option 3, because to me it at least acknowledges a step in that direction, while still maintaining a fair amount of flexibility. So that's where I would go.
I'm so happy you said all of that. I'm just going to say I agree with Commissioner Barbe. I think 3 is great. And knowing that this specific plan is within a transit-oriented zone, so that AB will supersede anything, makes me really happy. So I would say number 2 or 3. 3 being my number 1 preferred.
Since our last meeting, I've thought about this a lot and drove around the city, kind of looked around, see what's going on. There were 2 news stories just recently in the past 2 days on this very issue over in Encinitas. So their solution was, giving out parking permits because there's there's various, residential units, and the apartment units were underparked. And in watching that and thinking about this and trying to balance everything, I think it's imperative that we make sure we're not making things any worse. So, you know what, I've been very much a proponent of looking at ways that we can help promote development in this redevelopment in this area. And I think what Adam has come back with reduced setbacks, the reduced open space, which are very good things that will increase the area that a developer can build upon. I'm not so much a fan now, like I was last week, for the 25% reduction. I think we're given some breaks on the development area, increasing that development area via those decreased setbacks and the things I had mentioned. So with that, I just have a couple of questions, Mr. Feinstein. So version or option 2, so to speak, and in looking at that, in the current code, there's no requirement for guest parking. Is that the case?
No, I apologize. There is a requirement I just didn't put it on here, but in every one of these situations, we would be looking at a quarter space per unit.
Quarter space. Okay, thank you. And that's basically current code. So, and then we have option 5. So option 5 looks like it takes the current code and provides a little bit more guest parking. Is that the case?
Yeah, so there's a couple differences here. Option 5 does not require guest parking for studios, but it has a higher number for 1, 2s, and 3s, slightly higher for 1s and 2s, and double for 3s as far as guest spaces. The other thing that you'll see though also is, I believe if we look here at 1 bedrooms for option 5, it's 1.25 per unit, and if we go back to zoning code, it's 1.5.
Got it.
So those are the 2 differences primarily.
Then the other question is, because I noticed the table that's in the specific plan itself says covered or uncovered. So in other words, are all of these required? Well, some of them are, 1 covered space, 1 covered space. All of these say 1 covered space. But what's in here says covered or uncovered. Is the intent to say you don't have to have covered?
No, the intent is that one of them has to be covered, whatever else
regardless.
You provide, right, and then whatever else you want to provide can or doesn't have to be.
Got it. I know it's a lot that I'm kind of throwing out there, and I'm kind of going in the opposite direction of where I was a week ago. So with that, I actually prefer number 5. What I don't want to have happen is I really am concerned because of the demographics, what we have going on here, the cost of housing and everything. I don't want to make the situation worse. But there's provisions in here now. If somebody wants to propose something less, that provision is here. So they can come back to this body, come to staff, make that request, come to this body, we can review it, and we can say, yes, you know what, because you're doing X, Y, and Z, it warrants a decrease in the number of parking stalls. If he doesn't want to go through that process, okay, well then, here it is, and we've decreased, I think, the potential impacts on the community. As we move forward into the future, there's nothing to say that this can't come back 3 years, 5 years, or we wait till 12 years, because this is what we're now seeing, is a dynamic shift in the need for parking. I doubt that will happen in the next 12 years. I think it's the future. I just don't see it happening within 12 years. So my vote is kind of for option 5.
Okay, so I was actually leaning more towards your 75%, the number 3 that you were more in favor of last week, but I prefer 6, because 6 is option 3 except for the smaller lots. All right, so you have a majority that wants 2 or wants 2, I guess.
That's what I heard. To specifically say, oh, I'm
Right.
sorry.
So essentially, and I like what you had to say, Stan, and I, especially with provisions that are in place, I think based on what I've heard, and I'm learning a lot still, I'm going to go with option 2.
Increases what I was about to say. Now I've heard 3 commissioners prefer option 2, and half a vote for option 2 because Carrie mentioned 2 and 3, right? Right, Carrie?
2 is great because we're in a transit-friendly zone and no one's going to try to get past that when they're
Okay.
developing a project.
Okay, and that's the one I'm most enthusiastic for.
Okay.
So the intent then would be to stick with what's in the zoning code? That's at least what I'm hearing at this point.
That's what it sounds like.
Yes.
Yeah, for a motion, Adam would like us, he has in a staff report 2 resolutions.
Chair, if I could, because there were a couple items that I wanted to kind of address before we, in the specific plan, before we move on to the resolution.
Okay.
Figure 7-1, and that's on page 61. So at one of the previous meetings, we eliminated the active frontage along Grand. And I'm looking at the northern portion of Ash, that's right along, Ash and Washington there. And all of those, that whole area is designated for residential. And so it kind of seems that since they're residential, there's no need to have that active frontage if the intent with the active frontage is to have the 16-foot ground floor ceilings.
Yeah, I think that this may have gotten lost in translation when we were talking through it, and we said, okay, we weren't in our discussion, and then how I relayed that to our consultant. It's like, okay, Ash is this and Grand is that, and it was just taken all the way up Ash. But I see what you're saying, that if you look at the area that's north of the flood control channel, it is all of the the urban 5 residential, not the mixed use designation. And if that's a change that the commission feels is appropriate, we can wrap that into a motion as well.
So, I'm sorry, we missed part of Ash?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have the exhibit here available on the screen, but if you do look at page 17 versus page 61 of the actual specific plan document, which, give me a second and I'll figure out what pages those are in the,
Oh,
so it's page, I can't read it because it's black underneath it. It's page 256 of the staff report of the agenda package is the land use table.
Right.
256.
yeah, that's it.
And then page 300 of the packet is the retail frontage, or the frontages exhibit. So if you look at both of those, and I do apologize that they were not provided in color if you received it from us, but the area that's north of the flood control channel, if you're looking at the land use map, 256, that is the orange color, or it's the urban residential 4-5, whereas the rest of the area along Ash on the north, or if you look, I guess, and then if we're looking at the frontages exhibit, so on 300, that's where you see that the frontages, active frontage area carries north of the flood control channel. So if we were intending for it only to be applied to areas that are designated either mixed use or general commercial, it does not achieve that right now.
Yeah, I think that was the intent.
Yep. Okay. So we can wrap that into any motion as well.
And then I do have one other item in looking at table 7.2, and I know that you addressed it in the staff report. In the staff report, it's pages 65 through 69, and it's land use allowances. And in there, it does say that firearms dealers are conditional use permits, are required to get conditional use permits in CG and MU. However, on table 7.2, it was still prohibited.
Good call. Good catch.
Well, there's another category for sporting goods, and it was
Right.
changed. It was changed there.
I saw that, but this was the standalone. So, I mean, the staff report addressed it, it just didn't happen to
Right.
get addressed on the
Right.
table.
Yep. I'll get that wrapped in there as well.
Chair, thank you, that was it. That was all my comments.
Okay. Would someone like to make a motion?
I'll make a motion. Let me get my numbers right. Bear with me. So, gosh, I'm going to have to remember all the changes here. The motion would be to approve PHG 20-0028, the East Valley Specific Plan, with the changes. God, how do we do this? Let's start with parking.
Adam just put up on the screen.
Yeah. So, with the changes as recommended by staff, including the parking option number 2.
Okay.
And
And I had two.
the 2 minor changes to Figure 7-1,
Table 7.
and Table 7-2 regarding firearm dealerships would be required to obtain a conditional use permit in the CG and the MU zone.
And could I also clarify, because I want to make sure that the resolution regarding the final PEIR gets wrapped into that.
Resolution.
Oh, yeah, and to adopt both of the resolutions, 2023-11 and 2023-12. Did I get it all? Apologies. I didn't write it all down, and I probably should have.
Thank you for putting that.
And a second?
Second.
Call for the vote?
Votes for Chair Paul,
Yes, approve.
Vice Chair Barbe,
Approved.
Commissioner Barber,
Approve.
Commissioner Fitzgerald,
Approve.
Commissioner Maccaro,
Approve.
Commissioner Spear,
Yes, approve.
and Commissioner Wiley.
Yes.
The vote is 7-0 to approve Resolution 2023-11 and 2023-12 with modifications.
Thank you. So I'd like to talk about one more item. So I really like the mixed use the concept. I grew up in New England, where there's all over the place is the stores on the first floor and a business above, and in the rural areas it's mixed use with a house over here and a store over here and another house over here, and there's some great opportunities for people to live and to work in their communities, and this isn't really relevant, but also those decisions on what gets to be built where are made in the community by the dozen people who show up to approve or deny that request, and I think that's a great form of government. But in regards to the choices of being able to live and work close together, I'd like to throw out make another motion, and that would be to allow any small business less than or equal to 1,000 square feet, but otherwise restricted in the East Valley Plan, to be allowed to exist via a CUP.
I have a question.
Sure.
We have currently in our table, we have certain restricted commercial uses listed.
Right.
You're suggesting that we override all of those with a conditional use.
Right, for a business 1,000 square feet or less. That we allow a person who wants to start a business to be able to apply for a CUP, even if it's not in the East Valley specific plan.
I would ask, just in consideration, I would ask there is, I suppose, a purpose in having restrictions on certain commercial uses. And maybe we consider that prior to overriding all of those with this sort of blanket process that would say, hey, you could. Now, I understand you're suggesting that be through a conditional approval process. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my question is, I don't know if this was discussed in my absence. I know that one particular use, and that is for gun stores, it sounds like. The others were not. I assume that when we discuss or restrict, and maybe this is a planning question, or maybe it's in reference to previous precedent within the city in other areas where restricted commercial uses were applied. The question is, what's the purpose for having restrictions on particular businesses? Is there a easy answer to that question in terms of precedents?
Sure. So, I mean, generally, land use restrictions and permitted uses are put into place and are looked at based on compatibility with surrounding areas. Uses that generate nuisance, probably not the best for a residential district. Maybe an industrial use, you don't want that in a residential area. You know, a nightclub next to your house, probably not the best idea, right? But the biggest issue, though, I'm seeing with what the chair has identified is that we haven't looked at this as part of the environmental review and environmental document. So that would be having to go back, analyze the additional uses and the additional intensity that could create, times 60, whatever, 100 units that hypothetically could be there, because the environmental document needs to look at that worst case scenario. So there is that challenge.
I'm kind of the proper order of things, first, second, and then discussion. But since we're now kind of in discussion, which is okay, I think we already moved past the specific plan. So to bring up a motion that has to relate to the specific plan, I'm not sure how that works because we've already voted. So maybe the opinion of the attorney on just course of action and our ability to actually even discuss this now.
So yes, you have voted already to recommend approval to the City Council of a specific plan. You've adopted the EIR, recommended adoption of the EIR. As I understand the chair's motion, at least my understanding of it would be that you would be voting now to also recommend that council add this on as sort of almost an addendum. I believe you can do that if you want. It's a little unorthodox. It wouldn't, but you have already approved the specific plan as it stands. This would be sort of an additional request to council, if you will.
Okay, and really I just wanted the clarification that we could actually do this. So.
But again, though, I actually second Adam's concern about the environmental review of this, because this has not undergone environmental review, so that is a problem.
Right. That's one of the reasons I said let 1,000 square feet or less. It would be a minimal impact, potentially. Okay, but I'm not hearing a second. Okay. Current business, there is none. Future agenda items, does anyone have an item they'd like to be on the agenda? No. Oral communications, there's no one left here. Planning Commissioners report, nada. And City Planners report.
Thank you all for the effort and time. I said this at the beginning, but I mean, we've been 4 weeks in a row at these meetings, holiday week. We've changed our day. We've met at different hours, and it's been amazing to have this dedication from this group of commissioners. I know I've said it over the past year, but I've never seen a commission as engaged as you guys are, and this past month has been a true example of that. And we'll be back again on Tuesday next week to meet once more. So we do have one item coming next week. It's a minor amendment to the land use table for the downtown specific plan. So that'll be on Tuesday. Beyond that, next meeting will be on the 25th. I don't know off the top of my head the items that might be on that agenda.
So, well, you did a great job with this, and it's been a pleasure to work with you on it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we're adjourned.